The air smells of salt, smoke, and fear. You don't know which burns worse, the fire devouring your home or the terror clawing through your chest. The roar of men you've never heard before echoes across the coast, their voices guttural, alien, like wild animals celebrating the hunt. You run, but it doesn't matter. You can't outrun the storm that has already swallowed your world. In the distance, their ships glimmer like black teeth against the sea, sleek and monstrous, slicing through the waves toward you. For a moment, you think they've come for gold. You'll learn soon enough they came for something far more valuable. You. When the Vikings raided foreign shores, they didn't simply take what glittered, they took what breathed. Every raid wasn't just about plunder, it was about people. Captured wives, daughters, and sisters became living currency, their worth measured in strength, youth, and beauty. The men who captured them didn't see them as victims. They saw investments. The truth buried beneath centuries of romantic tales and pop culture fantasies is that the Vikings built one of the most efficient slave systems in early Europe, and its cruelty began the moment the women were seized. Imagine the scene. A village in Ireland or the Scottish Isles, its thatched huts burning as longships drag themselves onto shore. Families flee toward the woods, clutching children and prayer beads. The men who can fight die first. Those who can't are bound. The women? They are dragged by the hair, wrists tied with rough hemp that bites into flesh until it bleeds. Behind them, the only world they've ever known collapses in flame and ash. For most, that was the last time they'd ever see their homeland again. To the Vikings, human life, especially female life, was a commodity. They called their slaves thralls, a word that came to mean both servant and thing. Once taken, a woman's name, her identity, her past, everything that made her human, was stripped away. She wasn't a wife anymore. She wasn't a daughter or mother. She was property, and this wasn't a rare practice. It was an industry, an engine that fueled the Norse economy for centuries. The popular image of the Viking, a fearless explorer or noble warrior, is only half the story. Behind every legendary voyage, every new colony founded across the North Atlantic, there were chains, tears, and blood. Their ships weren't just vessels of discovery, they were floating prisons. The long, narrow hulls that made Viking raids so effective were also designed to transport their most profitable cargo, people. And among those people, women were the most prized. Every captured wife faced a journey that blurred the line between suffering and survival. She might be marched for miles, half-starved and beaten before being packed into a ship with dozens of others. The voyage could last weeks, cold, wet, brutal. Many didn't survive. Those who did often wished they hadn't. The lucky ones ended up in bustling slave markets like Dublin or Birka, sold and resold like livestock. Others were sent deeper into the Norse world, to Iceland, Norway, or beyond, where their new masters waited. Some became servants, some concubines, and some were killed in rituals to honor the gods. The word luck doesn't mean much when every possible fate is a different form of death. To understand what happened to these women is to confront the truth of the Viking world, that its greatness was built on human suffering, its wealth bought with stolen lives. What the Vikings did to captured wives wasn't an accident of war. It was policy, economics, and belief intertwined. Their society normalized ownership of human beings so completely that even their myths and sagas speak of slaves not with pity, but with indifference. And if that sounds monstrous, remember this: these were people who saw the act of taking a woman as both a right and a reward. Sexual slavery wasn't a secret shame. It was celebrated. The concubine, the frilla, was as common in a chieftain's hall as the fire pit that burned at its center. She wasn't there by choice. She was a trophy, a living reminder of conquest. The sagas that survive from medieval Iceland tell stories of such women, mute, nameless figures who appear in the background of great men's lives. Yet behind every legend carved into stone, there was someone whose screams the sea has long since swallowed. The worst part wasn't just the physical brutality, it was the ritualized nature of it, the way their suffering became part of the Norse worldview. In many cases, these women weren't just enslaved, they were used in ceremonies meant to display power. At funerals of great warriors, it wasn't uncommon for a female thrall to be forced to join her dead master in the afterlife. That meant she was publicly raped, drugged, strangled, and stabbed. Her body burned alongside his to symbolize loyalty. Even in death, she was a possession, and yet, despite how horrific it sounds, this system endured for generations because it worked. The Viking expansion from the British Isles to the edges of Asia was financed by this trade in flesh. The silver that poured into Scandinavia, the wealth that built their ships, their halls, their empires, was bought with the bodies of captured women. But what made it even more horrifying wasn't just what they did, it was how ordinary it was to them. For the men who commanded these ships, raids were investments. Every oar stroke, every sword swing was a business decision. The captured wives and daughters were part of the return on that investment. And just like gold or silver, they could be traded, gifted, or sold for profit. The cruelty of the system lay not in spontaneous violence, but in its cold, organized efficiency. It wasn't chaos, it was commerce. When a Viking chieftain prepared a raid, he wasn't just thinking of loot. He was calculating the human yield. A monastery on a remote island wasn't just an easy target. It was a potential gold mine of captives. Women, monks, children, anyone who could be forced to work, serve, or be sold was part of the equation. For every longship launched into the mist, there were partners, wealthy Norsemen, who had invested in its voyage. They expected a return, and nothing was more profitable than flesh. Imagine the moment a captured woman arrives in Dublin, the Norse stronghold built atop Irish soil. The market buzzes with the shouts of traders and the cries of the enslaved. Wooden pens line the muddy street. Inside them, human beings, bruised, bound, terrified. A chieftain inspects a young woman like livestock, checking her teeth, her wrists, her hair. He haggles with the seller. Behind him, piles of silver coins glint in the pale light. When he nods and the trade is made, the girl's life is erased. She doesn't even belong to herself anymore. From there, her fate could follow many paths, none merciful. She might end up in a chieftain's household, forced into endless labor, grinding grain, hauling water, scrubbing hides until her hands bled. Others were sent east, sold to traders who would carry them down the great rivers toward the Byzantine Empire. To these men, distance didn't matter. A woman stolen from an Irish coast might end up in Constantinople, her value multiplied with every transaction. The brutality of the journey was legendary. The ships offered no shelter from the cold. Captives were packed so tightly they could barely move. The waves that crashed over the sides soaked them to the bone, and the salt burned their wounds. When storms hit, the crew tied them down so they wouldn't wash away, not out of compassion, but to protect their investment. Death was common. The bodies of the dead were thrown overboard, vanishing beneath the black water without ceremony. The survivors watched and waited for their turn. When these ships finally reached harbor, the women who stumbled onto shore were no longer the same people who had been dragged from their homes. They were broken, stripped of identity, their eyes hollow. For the Vikings, this transformation was the point. Fear, silence, obedience, these were the qualities of a perfect thrall. And so the system continued, generation after generation, turning free women into ghosts. But even among this horror, some roles were worse than others. The concubine, the frilla, was a fixture in Norse households. She wasn't a wife, not even in name. She was a possession meant for pleasure, a reward for warriors or lords. Her days were spent in silence, serving at the table by day and in the master's bed by night. There was no escape, no appeal, no justice. Her body belonged to him completely, and everyone in the household knew it. The sagas that glorify the Viking Age rarely dwell on these women. They appear only in fragments, unnamed, voiceless, often described as fair or foreign. In the Laxdæla saga, an Irish princess named Melkorka is bought by an Icelandic chieftain after being taken in a raid. She gives birth to his son, a boy who will one day become powerful. Yet even as a mother, even as the source of his bloodline, she remains a slave. The saga treats this as normal, almost honorable. Her pain isn't a tragedy, it's just a part of the story. This normalization is perhaps the most terrifying part of all. In the Norse worldview, owning another human being wasn't evil, it was status. A powerful man might boast of how many thralls he possessed, just as he would of his horses or ships. It was a measure of success. To live in a world where such cruelty was not only accepted but celebrated is to glimpse how deeply normalized dehumanization can become when it's profitable. And yet, even within this structure of ownership, there were darker layers. Archaeologists have unearthed graves where the line between servant and sacrifice is horrifyingly clear. In the burial of a high-ranking Viking woman at Oseberg, 2 female bodies were found. One clearly noble, the other younger, poorer, her bones showing signs of trauma. Many scholars believe she was a thrall, killed to serve her mistress in the afterlife. In other graves, decapitated bodies lie beside their masters, symbols of loyalty forged in blood. These were not isolated acts. Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan's account of a Viking funeral along the Volga River paints a scene so vivid it reads like a nightmare. A chieftain's death demanded a companion, a woman who would volunteer to die with him. She was dressed, drunk, paraded, and violated before being strangled and stabbed on the burning ship. Her death wasn't seen as cruelty, it was ritual, tradition, spectacle. The men beat their shields to drown out her screams, not to show mercy, but to keep the other women from panicking. This was how the Vikings honored their dead, with the blood of the enslaved. The rituals reveal what life truly meant in that world. Ownership, power, and dominance written into every act. A woman could be born free one day and be reduced to property the next. Her value ended when her usefulness did. And yet, this very system built the wealth and glory the sagas would later celebrate. The longships, the silver hoards, the voyages to Iceland, all were made possible by hands that worked under chains. When historians uncover Viking artifacts, they often find coins, Islamic dirhams, buried deep in Scandinavian soil. Each coin is a silent echo of the trade routes that linked the Norse world to the east. But those coins didn't just represent trade in furs or timber, they represented people. Every glint of silver was bought with human suffering. The legacy of this human trade runs deeper than ruins and coins. It's written in the DNA of the North itself. Modern genetic studies in Iceland reveal a haunting truth. Nearly 80% of the island's male ancestry traces back to Norse settlers, but over 60% of its female ancestry originates from Gaelic lands, Ireland and Scotland. These women didn't cross the sea willingly. Their bloodlines are living proof of centuries of abduction, enslavement, and forced breeding. Iceland, a nation celebrated for its Viking roots, was literally born from conquest and captivity. Every generation that followed carried both the pride of the conqueror and the silence of the conquered, and that silence was deliberate. In Norse law, the enslaved had no voice. A thrall could not testify in court, own property, or marry. If she was beaten or killed, her master faced no punishment. Her existence was a void in the legal record. She wasn't a citizen or even a person. She was wealth. The law codes of Iceland and Norway make it chillingly clear. A thrall's worth was measured not in humanity, but in currency, the same language used for livestock and tools applied to her. Within the walls of the longhouse, daily life reinforced this hierarchy. A captured wife might be tasked with the lowest, dirtiest labor, tending fires, hauling water, scraping hides, or spinning wool until her fingers cracked. Textile production, a cornerstone of the Norse economy, was powered almost entirely by enslaved women. The sails that caught the Atlantic winds, the cloth that lined the warrior's cloak, all were woven by hands that had once clutched the doorframes of burning homes. If she survived long enough, she might bear her master's child. That child would be called a frillborn, the offspring of a concubine. His fate depended on his father's whim. The master could choose to free him, grant him inheritance, or cast him aside. A son could be raised to power or condemned to live as property, a mirror of his mother's suffering. Each decision was a display of dominance, reminding everyone in the household who held absolute control. For the free wife of the household, the presence of a frilla was a constant humiliation. In the same home where she ruled as mistress, another woman, enslaved, silenced, forced, was being used by her husband. The sagas describe this tension without shame. To the Norse, jealousy wasn't a moral argument against concubinage. It was simply a domestic inconvenience. The society had normalized the subjugation so completely that even women born free accepted it as an unchangeable truth. What made this normalization possible wasn't just cruelty, it was belief. In the Viking worldview, hierarchy was sacred. The gods themselves lived within a system of rank and order. Odin ruled from above, thralls served below. To own slaves was to mirror divine structure. The wealthy justified their power as natural, ordained. To them, the suffering of the weak was as inevitable as winter. But the stories that survive tell a different truth, one written not by the powerful, but by time. Archaeologists have unearthed bones showing signs of malnutrition, fractures from heavy labor, and spine deformities caused by endless bending. Many of these remains belong to young women, some barely adults. Their skeletons tell the story their masters never did, a lifetime of exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Even after Christianity began to spread through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, the chains didn't fall away overnight. Conversion changed the rituals, not the system. The church discouraged the enslavement of baptized Christians, but the Viking elite simply redirected their raids toward pagan lands. Slavic, Baltic, and Finnish peoples now became the targets. The machine adapted. The prophets stayed the same. Slowly, over generations, the old slave system evolved into something softer but no less oppressive. Serfdom. Freedom became a spectrum rather than a right. The Viking world had changed, but the foundation, domination, hierarchy, and control remained untouched. And beneath it all, the memory of the women who built that world in silence lingered like a shadow no one wanted to name. Still, not every story ended in silence. Some thralls earned freedom through loyalty, others through favor. The process was called manumission. A master could grant a slave her freedom as a reward, or sometimes as an offering to the gods. There are rune stones across Scandinavia bearing inscriptions from freedmen and women, small, defiant testaments to survival. One reads, "Toki the smith raised this stone for Thorgils, who gave him gold and freedom." Even here, though, the hierarchy persists. Freedom is still a gift, not a right, bestowed from above, never seized from below. And yet, these rare exceptions reveal something profound, the human desire to be remembered. Most of the women stolen, beaten, and forgotten left no trace, not even a name. But for those who did, the very act of carving words into stone was rebellion. It said, "I lived." Their existence forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about the Viking Age. We imagine explorers and warriors carving a new world out of ice and ocean. But their triumphs were built on the backs of enslaved people. Every coin, every ship, every saga carries that weight. The same culture that prized honor and bravery also turned the suffering of women into a commodity. It's easy to forget this because the stories that survive were written by the victors. The skalds and scribes who shaped Viking memory had no interest in mourning the enslaved. Their poems glorified battle, not bondage. The women who were dragged from their homes weren't heroes. They were resources. Their pain didn't fit into epic verse, but history, as it always does, leaves traces. The soil of Scandinavia is full of them: iron shackles, burial pits, fragments of tools made by enslaved hands. Each artifact is a whisper from the past, saying what the sagas refuse to say aloud. The image of the Viking, a wild, free warrior of the north, has become legend. But legends lie. The truth is that their freedom was bought at the price of others' chains. The Viking world thrived on contrast: freedom for the few, bondage for the many. Yet even among the enslaved, there existed hierarchies. A woman born into servitude in Scandinavia might have been treated differently from one captured in a raid. The former was seen as domestic labor, a fixture of the household economy. The latter, especially if she was foreign, beautiful or noble, was a prize, a symbol of power. Her suffering was public, performative, and deliberate. To possess her was to announce dominance, to remind rivals that even their most sacred bonds, marriage, lineage, kinship, could be violated and owned. It wasn't enough for the Vikings to defeat their enemies. They wanted to consume them, and nothing symbolized that more than taking an enemy's wife. To claim a man's woman was to destroy his legacy. Her body became the battlefield where victory was made eternal. The sagas are filled with moments that reveal this unspoken code. To steal another man's wife or daughter wasn't just lust. It was conquest extended into the private realm, a second war waged in the home. For the captured women, this meant living every day at the mercy of her owner's mood. Some were forced into breeding, their children raised as slaves or lesser heirs. Others were sold repeatedly, passed from one hand to another, each new owner erasing whatever remnants of identity they still clung to. And through it all, the Norse chroniclers wrote of these events with an almost chilling normalcy. Words like taken, given, or kept replaced any acknowledgement of pain. The brutality was hidden in plain sight, disguised by language. In some Norse communities, particularly in Iceland, concubines bore sons who rose to prominence. Their achievements were celebrated, but never their mothers. These women existed as shadows behind great men, their silence forming the unseen structure that upheld Norse glory. When we read of heroes crossing storm-tossed seas or founding new colonies, we forget that beside them, or beneath deck, were the enslaved women spinning wool, nursing children, and enduring assaults. What made their suffering even more devastating was its permanence. Slavery in the Viking Age wasn't a temporary state. It was hereditary. A child born to a thrall inherited her status. Freedom was not a birthright, it was an accident, a favor, or a miracle. In this way, the system perpetuated itself, generation after generation. It didn't need to capture new slaves to survive, it bred its own. And yet the world outside began to change. Christianity spread, kingdoms united, and trade routes shifted. Slowly, the Viking slave economy began to erode, not because of moral awakening, but because it became less profitable. As Europe stabilized and new markets opened, raiding declined. The long ships that once carried captives now carried merchants, but even as the sails changed color, the memory of what built them remained woven into the fabric of northern life. Archaeologists studying burial grounds across Scandinavia continue to uncover signs of this dual reality. In some graves, The remains of noblemen rest beside the bones of enslaved women, their positions deliberate. The master elevated, the servant crouched or chained. In others, women's bodies bear cuts on the ribs and neck, physical proof of ritual killing. Each discovery forces us to confront how normalized death and domination had become. Even in the afterlife, hierarchy persisted, and in the Viking imagination, that hierarchy was cosmic. They believed that slaves too had a place in Valhalla, but only as servants to their masters for eternity. Freedom, even in death, was a privilege reserved for warriors. The same mythology that promised eternal glory to the slain condemned the enslaved to eternal servitude. It was a theology of power, crafted by those who held it. Yet within that darkness, traces of resistance still flicker. Some enslaved women, according to scattered sources, escaped and found refuge among rival tribes or Christian monasteries. Others fought back in smaller ways, through sabotage, refusal, or survival itself. Their names are lost, but their defiance lives in the cracks of the record. For every line written by a conqueror, there were countless untold acts of quiet rebellion that made endurance itself an act of defiance. The decline of Viking slavery came not with sudden enlightenment, but with transformation. As the Norse world merged into medieval Christendom, the old thrall system gave way to feudalism. People were still bound to land and lord, but the language changed, the brutality less visible. The enslaved became serfs. Their chains were now economic rather than iron. It was progress only in name. Still, the disappearance of open slavery left a void in the cultural memory of the North. The sagas, written centuries later, romanticized the past. The pillagers became pioneers, the raiders became explorers, and the enslaved were erased. The brutality was rewritten as adventure, the horror rebranded as heritage. And so, history repeated its oldest trick, turning cruelty into legend. When modern audiences picture Vikings, they see longships slicing through fog, warriors with axes raised high, flames licking the sky. What they don't see are the women bound beneath those sails, or the cries swallowed by the wind. Yet those voices are still there if you listen, to the soil, to the bones, to the DNA that carries their memory forward. The true legacy of the Viking Age is not found in their sagas or conquests, but in the invisible empire they built on human suffering. The trade in women wasn't a side effect of their power, it was its foundation. Without it, there would have been no wealth to build ships, no manpower to sustain colonies, no silver to fill their halls. Every achievement of that age was stained with the suffering of those who had no choice but to serve. And that, perhaps, is the darkest truth of all, that greatness and cruelty often share the same origin. The myth of the noble Viking persists because it's comforting. It lets us admire the courage without confronting the cost. But history doesn't allow comfort for long. The archaeological record, the written chronicles, and even the bloodlines of their descendants tell a different story, one of conquest, captivity, and silence. To understand the Viking Age, we must look not only at the men who swung the swords, but at the women who endured them. Theirs is the story that was buried, but not forgotten. Centuries later, the echoes of that world still linger in quiet ways. The sagas survived, yes, but only because they were written by men who never questioned the system they glorified. Their tales celebrated courage, loyalty, and fate, but they left no space for the cries of the enslaved. Yet history, like the sea, has a way of uncovering what's been buried. Archaeology, genetics, and cross-cultural chronicles have pieced together what the poets omitted, that beneath every Viking victory was a trail of human suffering, often borne by women whose only crime was being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their lives were erased from memory, but not from the record of the earth. In burial mounds, their bones lie beside the weapons of their captors. In rune stones, their absence speaks louder than any inscription. and in the faces of their descendants, from the Irish coasts to the Icelandic fjords, their story continues silently, coded in flesh and blood. The Vikings may have sought to immortalize themselves through conquest, but they immortalized their victims too, in ways they could never have foreseen. For every saga hero like Ragnar or Eric, there were hundreds of unnamed women whose stories ended on a longship, a slave market, or a funeral pyre. Their suffering was not collateral damage. It was the very foundation of the Norse world. Their labor built the wealth of kingdoms. Their forced children populated new colonies. Their silence gave rise to songs of victory. Without them, the Viking Age as we know it could not have existed. And yet, as time passed, their memory was scrubbed clean by myth-making. Horned helmets, noble warriors, romantic seafarers, modern imagination turned butchers into icons. The truth was far less glorious. The Vikings didn't just raid villages, they dismantled entire lives. They didn't just plunder wealth, they redefined what it meant to own another human being. Their violence wasn't random, it was systemic, profitable, and normalized. The Norse saw no contradiction between praying to gods of war and practicing cruelty and peace. They could sing praises to Odin while a woman screamed in the next room. That duality, the ability to honor valor while ignoring horror, may be what makes their story so enduring. It mirrors something uncomfortably human, our ability to glorify the conqueror and forget the conquered. If you walk through modern Scandinavia, you'll find museums dedicated to Viking heritage, long ships preserved under glass, weapons displayed with reverence. But for every artifact of power, there should be a monument to the powerless, to the women whose names were lost in translation, whose bodies became offerings, whose voices the wind carried away over the North Sea. The true history of the Viking Age isn't carved on stone. It's whispered through the soil. Perhaps the most haunting realization is this: those women didn't disappear. They became the ancestors of nations. Their children bore both the blood of captor and captive, blending pain and survival into one lineage. Modern Icelanders, Scots, and Norwegians carry fragments of that past in every cell. It is proof that even in the darkest systems of domination, the oppressed leave their mark. Their endurance, not their suffering, is what outlasted empire. When we tell the story of the Vikings, we must tell all of it: the discovery, the innovation, and the horror. To remember only their bravery is to repeat their cruelty. To honor only their exploration is to erase the cost of it. History demands we face both truths at once, that civilization and barbarity often coexist in the same hands. So the next time someone mentions the Viking spirit, courage, adventure, defiance, remember the unseen side of that spirit too, the side that chained the innocent, silenced the enslaved, and built its greatness upon grief. The Viking Age wasn't just an age of heroes, it was an age of victims. And their story deserves to be told with the same weight, the same reverence, the same fire. Because history isn't only what the victors wrote, it's what the silenced endured. And that endurance, more than conquest or glory, is the truest testament to human strength. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. We bring these stories to light because the past, especially its darkest corners, shapes everything we are today. So if you found this eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button, share this video to keep these voices alive, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden truths of our history. Tell us in the comments, what surprised you most about the real Viking Age? We read every comment, and your thoughts inspire our next exploration. Because remembering them isn't just history, it's justice.